I'm quite interested in people who recover without abstinence, for example, and what that looks like, and whether or not there's a place for them in the recovery movement.
And I see that, and even amongst the the recovery community that I live, work, and support amongst, but in other spaces, I see people that do that, particularly with what they might refer to as their secondary or third drug. So the primary drug causes them all sorts of problems. They get shifted from that. Sometimes a period of maybe abstinence of all things, but if they've had a huge problem with, I know someone that had a, very big problem with a lot of what we might call dance-orientated drugs for years and years and years and years, and has finally managed to return to raves and parties, but wouldn't go into those raves or parties and take any pharmaceuticals, but can do it quite safely on what I would consider a relatively low level of beer. They might have 2 or 3 cans of cider during that evening. So they're clearly not abstinent in terms of drugs.
No. Getting into a kind of ecstatic state, it doesn't require chemicals, really.
No, exactly.
Again, NA in the 80s, we did a lot of clubbing, up at Camden Town and stuff, and Africa Bambaataa and all that, and people got very ecstatic in the sense of being able to let go of themselves and enjoy the experience. But none of us were taking any kind of mood altering chemicals. But I think the return to, there are obviously huge ranges of subjects that this talk can't really get into, but
yes.
Why
we come back for another.
Some people who are abstinent say, well, nobody needs to drink and stuff, which is true, but yes, nevertheless there are reasons why some people may choose to reintegrate alcohol into their lives, or they're able to use alcohol in a way that is not addictive or damaging, even though they may have had a extensive period where it was. We don't understand who can do that and why they can do that. There are some ideas. Bill White, who I would like to mention, because discovering him was another enormous, kind of Aladdin's cave moment.
And we have to say, Bill White carries a massive shadow across everything we probably do in recovery voices at some level.
I started reading Bill in the early 2000s. I think I'd come across some of his stuff before that, but I hadn't really recognised it. But before he came to the UK to talk at a conference which we invited him to, I'd started reading this guy, and suddenly there was this bloke who'd just written so sensitively and wisely and about virtually everything. If anything you needed to know about treatment, recovery, what addiction is like, what recovery is like, the kind of dilemmas and the polarizations and the evolutions, he had written about it. And he never wrote about it in a dogmatic fashion. He would always leave the conversation open. At the end of a Bill article, he hasn't answered the question. He's posed more questions, and I think that's really, again, made me admire his writing very much. And he wrote a paper called Can Drug Addicts Drink? It's worth having a look at, because he certainly doesn't answer the question. He's not going to say yes or no, but he puts forward loads of interesting arguments and experiences that people have had, and how the TC movement basically didn't pay attention to alcohol, and a lot of people fell victim to that. And yet, the inevitable truth that some people who've had drug addictions can drink without any problems at all. Now, again, the way he writes about that is fascinating, and I would recommend anybody who's listening to this to seek out Bill White and have a look at what he's been writing.
And I'm very conscious what we're talking about happens in other ways with other substances as well, doesn't it? I do come across quite a few people who would definitely describe themselves as alcoholics going into their treatment and recovery, but who come out the other end and remain, whatever we want to call that, but they're definitely cannabis users. They
can be. People work this out from their personal experience, which is of course exactly how the people in AA did it. If you can't handle stuff, you eventually find out.
Yes.
And if you keep returning to stuff you can't handle, then eventually you think, why, this is crazy. So people who need abstinence generally find it if they don't die first. That's definitely evidence-based statement. And of course, it's much more socially acceptable now to be abstinent from alcohol, from tobacco, and all of these other things than it was 50 years ago. It's much less socially deviant to be a teetotaler now than it used to be. And that's very important because it gives people a lot more opportunity. And probably one of the reasons why recovery from alcoholism is easier in the States is because, there's huge numbers of Americans are abstinent from alcohol for all kinds of reasons. A majority, actually, are black women, for example. And that cultural difference and the social dynamics and the way that, again, I would mention, I'm going to mention, I've forgotten her name, Nancy Campbell. Yeah, I mean, again, a hugely interesting commentator on the kind of sociological, political, historical aspects of addiction and the way people respond to it and the way people view it. Incredibly interesting person and vivid. The writing is so wow. Every sentence you think there's an insight there that's worth holding on to.